we are seeing a situation where elections are being tweaked with, so that it's more and more easy for the Conservatives to win and more difficult for anyone else to win. And the most obvious examples of that is the plans to bring in compulsory voter ID, which would disenfranchise lots of people without existing photo ID. So that obviously discriminates against younger people, poor people, people from minority backgrounds that are less likely to have those documents. And then we combine that with the coming boundary review of constituencies. And some of you will remember that we're now a number of years into a new system of voting registration, which means that whereas in the past, you were able to have one person sign up everyone in a household and they're all on the register. Now everyone has to do that individually. It's easy to fall off the list. And again, it means that people are being missed from the list, losing their right to vote unless they're being really careful about it. But also, the new constituency boundaries are based on those smaller numbers of registrations, not on the population of an area, which in effect means that we're going to see a shift of representation from urban areas to richer areas that tend to vote Conservative. So that's the changing the goalpost of election side of things. Then let's talk about accountability. So you won't have been able to miss some of the kind of scandals that have been jumping up in recent weeks. So the government announced recently a review of the judicial review system. So this is a really important check on the powers of government, where if they abuse their power, we as members of the public have the ability to take them to court and to challenge that decision. It's been used a lot in the past, and the government is now consulting on whether that should be changed, weakened, or basically letting MPs decide the realms of what can be judged on by the courts. And in a situation with a really big majority, then that is something that we should be really concerned about. And similar things are on the cards for the Human Rights Act. We know that the Conservatives have been having that in their sights for a very long time. They now perhaps have the numbers that they can to actually weaken that. So the final thing to say about accountability then is the Coronavirus Act. Now, many people won't have been paying very much attention to the details of that act because of the situation at the time, but it gives the government really extraordinary powers that were even broader than what they had under something called the Civil Contingencies Act, which is very wide-ranging and gave the government a lot of ability to deal with really serious emergencies. But what that act did, the Coronavirus Act did, was to loosen many of the rules on tendering of contracts for government work. So this is why we're seeing news story after news story of government contracts being doled out to either private companies with no real historic history of doing the work involved, or to companies that actually have very clear links between either Conservative donors or the people in the government, because the rules that are meant to control that sort of thing have just been suspended because of the pandemic. So we're seeing a situation where it's then making it easier to stay in government and to stop anyone else coming into power, stopping anyone being able to hold them accountable for the decisions that they make whilst in power, and there being kind of conveyor belts for a real blurring of private and public sector. Some people would say corruption. We can't prove that, but these people come from very similar social backgrounds, and this would maybe seem very natural to people. So a really good example then of how most of us don't have much say in politics is looking at the example of no-deal Brexit that we're now facing down the barrel of. So there was a small cabal, basically, a number of years ago that was pushing for Brexit when it didn't really register on the list of public concerns. We had a referendum on that, that's fine. But moving so swiftly from the idea that we'd leave the EU to actively pushing for a no-deal Brexit is something that has not emerged organically from a social movement. It's not something that people at the grassroots have been demanding. It's the plan of a small cabal of business interests and people from a very similar background that they've managed to push into government consideration through the use of money and other networks that we'll come into. So extreme centralisation is the cornerstone of British politics. That's why this stuff is able to happen. So, if you want to influence government decisions at the national level, there's a few ways you can do this. You can either donate money to the party of your choice, and they'll owe you a favour for that. You can set up a think tank, which are often just thinly veiled lobbying groups, but who have very good access to government. And you can use those same think tanks to get your ideas into the mainstream media, and by pushing ideas that wouldn't otherwise be there. So by combining that with the ownership of the media in this country, which is very concentrated in not just a few hands, and those owners tend to be pretty reactionary, you've got this system that works very well together to push what are basically interests that only benefit the very richest in society, and while the rest are struggling to have much say at all. So it's no wonder in that circumstance that right-wing populism is growing, when people see decisions being made so nakedly in the interests of the few. So I wanted to say a bit about how we got into this mess. So the thing about Britain is that it's never been a democracy in the purest sense of the word. We have a post-imperial nation state that's had elections grafted onto it, basically. It's a post-imperial state. So history shows us that that comes about because of levels of disruption to the status quo and a level of threat to the ruling elite, where they're really thinking, well, we're facing potentially a revolutionary situation unless we give in to some of these demands. And if we look at the Chartist movement, if we look at the suffragettes, that's exactly what's happened, where these movements have become so powerful that the people that had very few challenges to their power saw no alternative but to accede to some of those demands. But many of that kind of like paraphernalia from this ancient imperial state really kind of continues to infect our political culture, I think. So the way that we talk about being ruled instead of taking part in government really says something about, almost as if we're still an absolute monarchy. And that says something really interesting about the residual culture of England in particular, perhaps. So there's this level of untouchableness, isn't there? So we just need to look about the rage around Dominic Cummings when earlier in the summer he nakedly broke lockdown rules. The people who almost never get angry about stuff the government doing were raging for him to go, and nothing happened because ultimately the government thought they could get away with that. And that's that, despite torpedoing the entire public health strategy. And academic research has confirmed that that episode has had a massive impact on levels of public trust in the government's management of the pandemic. So, I said just now that the only ways that real massive change happened in a pre-democratic age was where working class movements were threatening a revolutionary situation. And in some ways that's changed, but in other ways it hasn't. So if we look at, for example, Extinction Rebellion and the protests they've been running over the past 2 years, that's taken a lot of disruption just to get the narrative of the climate crisis talked about. As I'm sure people here will agree, that the government hasn't really adopted the substance of its demands, and they've gone to a lot of work just to get that far. So that really says something about the system that we're living in and that we need to change. So let's look at that in a bit more depth. So under the unwritten British Constitution, which is a hangover from this imperial state with democracy tacked on, there's, I think, kind of three main key problems here. So centralisation. The British state is one of the most centralised states in the developed world. And if you've only got one site of power, it's really easy for one group of people to dominate. So if the leading politicians all went to Eton, are all in the same social group, for example, it's very easy for people with very aligned interests to be in touch with these people and for the decisions they're making to seem really natural. And if you only have one site of government, you have less work on your hands to influence that. The more that power is spread out at a local level and in other ways, the more difficult it is and the more expensive it is, crucially, for rich interests to dominate decision making. And that's one big reason why decentralization of power is a really important thing. Then there's the lack of checks and balances. So this is a really big problem of our unwritten constitution. Once the government has been put in power, there's very few limits on what it can do. And as long as they think that they can win the next election, there's very few consequences for that. So if we just look at the behaviour of the Conservatives in the last election, where they pushed a number of things to new extremes in terms of disinformation, there are no checks for that. There are no effective consequences for that. And now we're seeing, people may have seen in the last couple of weeks, that there are proposals to effectively weaken the powers of the Electoral Commission by making the government in charge of its remit instead of a group within Parliament that's more balanced by parties. So if we have an elections regulator that can't actually enforce the rules, and as you'll all know, it's really struggling to do that anyway, in the case of vote leave, systematically overspending during the EU referendum, it's a big problem, lack of checks and balances. And then the final big feature of the system that we have right now is that important laws can be overturned by a simple majority. And this is even more the case now with us leaving the EU, where, I would have criticisms about the EU, certainly, but there was a kind of rules-based system where certain groups were obviously in charge of making certain rules, and there were majorities for things. It was very difficult to just suddenly change the human rights that everyone in the EU is entitled to, for example. Whereas with the Human Rights Act here, that could be overturned tomorrow with one vote. There are lots of laws that in theory have constitutional status but can be overruled in just the same way. And that's one of the big problems we're seeing this week with the Internal Market Bill, where it's stealing powers from devolved governments and is really threatening a real crisis situation for anyone that cares about the union. Because even though in theory and in the minds of the public in Scotland and Wales, though those bodies are permanent things, they could be abolished by one vote technically tomorrow. That's another thing about centralisation of the UK system. So the way in which this power, this unregulated space implements things has grown quite a lot in the last few years. So there was a time when, whether you had activists on the ground, whether you had any real grassroots supports for your policies really mattered, that you wouldn't be able to just get something like no deal Brexit through purely on the strength of money. But what we saw particularly in the general election last year is that the rise of social media has allowed dark money to run an unprecedented election influencing machine. So it no longer matters if you don't have activists or members or any kind of organic support for your agenda, because you can just use this kind of like infinitely reproducing machine of social media to put messages in front of people. As long as you've got the money to do that, then there's no real limit on what you can do if you've researched your messages and are able to manipulate people's emotions in that way. And what's really critical here is that since the 70s onwards, governments have gone about really destroying any sort of counterpower in society. So if we think about how the reason we have any democracy in Britain is thanks to the trade union movement and a lot of kind of proto working class movements before that point. There were times in our history where there were workers organising like parallel parliaments, organising parallel, planning to have armed uprisings against the government. So the decline of unions, the decline of coalitions of social movements means that it's easier for that central power to not be challenged, basically. And when governments aren't challenged, we've seen that in the catastrophic failures that the government in the UK has had with its handling of COVID from testing and tracing to ventilators to the list is too long to talk about. So let's talk a bit about some of the solutions to this. And for me, it's really about participation and increasing the number of sites where that can happen. So democracy can't just be something that happens in Westminster, and it can't be something that just happens in council chambers. It has to be about building popular participation and collective community power. So key to this, I think, is breaking down the idea that democracy begins and ends with voting every few years. And I think that's one reason why we need to think bigger than proportional representation as well. That's often the thing that we go to as campaigners in thinking this is the thing that's going to fix the system. PR is absolutely the first step that is needed to open up the possibility of further change to our political system. But we need to be really aware that it won't fundamentally change the power dynamics, and that we need to think about going much much further if we want a real democracy. So some solutions then. Democracy is not just about voting every few years, it's about mass participation regularly in the decisions that affect our lives. And anything less than that is going to leave us vulnerable to the power of the super rich, like I've talked about. So that means if we have some power at a local level, like you do in Oxford with council seats, for example, is to find any way you can to get people more participating more in those decisions and really opening the doors of the town hall. So in the past, people have experimented with things like, I think they were called ward parliaments in Oxford back in the day before they were got rid of. There's been experiments with participatory budgeting where people start to think collectively about what the main needs of the area are and realizing that they know more about their area than they think they do. So there are a number of things that can be done at a local level, and Oxford has shown the start of that with the things like the Climate Citizens Assembly, but I think you need to keep pushing for a permanent expansion, basically, of how people are engaged in decision making locally. So at a national level, we basically need to own our own democracy, and what Unlocked Democracy is calling for is a new people-powered constitution to replace the system that we have now. And at the moment, we're campaigning for a People's Convention on Post-COVID Democracy. So that's based around a number of demands about what democracy should look like in the future, and that includes things like big decisions that change the whole makeup of how a system works shouldn't be decided unilaterally by politicians. There has to be public involvement in making those decisions. And has to be, we have to have a settlement that protects local government from Whitehall meddling as well. So I'll end it there. On our website, you can find on the front page a link to these democratic future principles that we're campaigning on at the moment. It'd be great if you signed up to those and helped us campaign for those. But thanks for listening, and it'd be great to have a bit of a chat about how this applies more locally as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Sam, for that. There's a huge amount of really important and hopefully stimulated things that Sam's touched on there. So just to remind everyone, this is the bit where we've got our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for Sam, then please do pop them in the chat. And if you also have any questions about anything regarding democracy locally here in Oxford, then Craig and Dick should be able to pick some of that stuff up. So I had quite a few questions submitted already. I'm going to take one specifically on voting systems. And I know towards the end that you said that, you know, voting systems aren't the be all and end all, and that's what everyone focuses on. But we're going to start there, and then hopefully we'll move on to the more in-depth kind of holistic stuff. So the question is specifically around voting systems and local government. So what voting systems do you see as being best at plugging the democratic gap at the different levels of local government? And are there any countries you know of that have got it right in terms of voting systems in local government elections?
Now, Unlocked Democracy is not actually very precious about what specific system that we would go for. We just say that we want a system that broadly matches the proportion of votes cast. But you know, my main familiarity with how vote proportional systems can work at a local level is places like Scotland and Ireland, where you have basically multi-member STV wards of kind of 3 or 4 seats. So that at a local level, I think there's a real need to preserve that kind of local resident link a little bit. And that's at a scale where you've also got a good chance of your party or whoever you're voting for being represented. Whereas, you know, if you had like list and closed list PR for the whole city, then, you know, I think that would really erase some of the local factors that are going on at a neighbourhood level. And, you know, one thing I throw into this as well is that we have some of the kind of toppest, how do I describe it? The level at which local government sits in Britain is very high. There's very few numbers of representatives per local resident compared to places like Norway or Spain or even France or Italy, where there's many more municipalities that really allow interest to be represented at a real micro level. So yeah, I think we need to look more broadly at kind of the scale at which local government is organised, and I know that's something that's a real live issue in Oxford in particular. But yeah, I would say that probably STV with, if you can, like boards of 4 members or more, is probably about the best balance you can get for that.
Brilliant, thanks Sam. Hopefully that was helpful in response to that question. So I've got a slightly different one now, which I guess is around how kind of democratic reform and engagement happens. So I've got a question here which is around yeah, I guess undermining the kind of the kind of structural problems with our democracy that you kind of touched upon and identified. So the question is there anywhere where you see that the powerful forces that are undermining our democracy are vulnerable? And this has kind of been prefaced with the idea that the traditional industrial working class resistance has gone, the stuff that you talked about before around organised labour essentially being a key driver of democratic reform, with I guess the kind of decline of the trade union movement and the decline of that kind of organised working class resistance. Where do you kind of see the kind of movement energy towards shifting towards a more democratic society coming from?
I think the main weakness about these forces that we're talking about is they don't actually have anything material or real to offer people, that it's often trading on fear. And if we look at those election campaigns that have been manipulated by the forces that we're talking about, they're very much fear driven for the most part. And the fact that they are being run at the kind of top digital centralized way is a weakness as well. We've seen interesting experiments in places like Frome where when a really committed group of local people come together and say, it's all a bit broken here, we're going to have a go at doing something differently, that they've been really successful. So building up local, the right is not organized locally. As I said, they don't have activists. So building up these, connecting local movements together, having a conversation about the sort of city that you want to have after COVID and the needs that aren't being met that we can meet if we work together. I think building real human connection and uniting the groups on the ground is a real good way to short circuit those processes, because I think if people are talking to people in their community about positive solutions to the problems that they're seeing, they're going to be less vulnerable, I suppose, to these really, really cynical, like negative emotional manipulation on online things. And thinking about kind of where the movement energy is, I think, I was personally very disappointed that the kind of left, the left campaign to get Labour leading a government last year failed. But I think that's led to a reassessment of a lot of people that were never kind of like Labour Party people, that they were in social movements and they decided, oh, this is a good project to go for right now. I think that those people are still going to want to do something with their time. So we're in a good situation, I think, to reach out to those groups and to really think about building new things on the ground that can maybe result in quite surprising electoral platforms. For example, there's very interesting examples of what we call municipalist campaigns in places like Spain and in the Spanish world in particular, where local coalitions of social movements that are not part of traditional party politics have taken control and really started to bring in these participatory things that I've been talking about. So yeah, if Greens in Oxford wanted to start off by having that kind of conversation with other groups, I think that would be a really interesting direction to follow.
Brilliant, thanks Sam. And that kind of local aspect of this kind of leads us on to a couple of other questions that have come in, which I think are really helpful in the current context. So I guess one of the things we've seen with the coronavirus pandemic is that there has been a degree of a kind of refostering of community that in many ways have been lost over the last 30 or 40 years, really, with the development of mutual aid groups, the people organising on a road level and to support each other and so on. And I guess the question that I've got is really about whether you think that this is a development that can really be built upon to help foster kind of a more democratically engaged citizenry that can help to, I guess, be the bedrock of the kind of more participatory democracy that you're talking about, but also, I guess, be key in driving those changes. And then I guess I've got a kind of related question, sort of, which has come in around, you mentioned what's happened in Frome, and wondered if you could elaborate a little bit about the kind of context in Frome, what people are doing there, and any other kind of similarly successful kind of local democratic experiments that you know of where people have come together and really kind of fostered that democratic culture on a local level.
Sure. Let's start with the kind of rebuilding of community stuff. So, you know, I think it's Adam Ramsey, isn't it, that often says that democracy is about like negotiating how we're going to live together. And one problem we've had in the past like 30 odd years with democracy is that people have forgotten, or the structures don't exist at a community level anymore to negotiate those things. If you're not involved in your union branch, you're not negotiating with people over doing something together, and life has become more atomized. So I think that, you know, the things like experience in mutual aid and people realizing that, oh yeah, we can look after each other, we've got these skills kind of inherent within us, is a really strong foundation for thinking about, you know, making the idea of more participatory democracy more credible. Now, I moved quite recently to a different area where I wasn't kind of bedded in with the mutual aid group here, but found out recently that they just decided to kind of decommission it instead of turning it into something more transformative that can really capitalize on that rebuilt community. And I was really, really sad about that, because I think that if there was some coordination at a national level to have a conversation about, we've built up this power, we've built up these community links, then that could be a really powerful new social movement that is organized in, you know, not based on, it's quite rare for a social movement to be based on, you know, the people on your street, rather than common interest in a very particular issue like the environmental movement, for example. So if that could be picked up, then I think that could be potentially really powerful, just because of the breadth and depth of the engagement that it's been able to build. So yeah, no kind of obvious answers to that one, I'm afraid, but I think it could be a really powerful foundation. On the examples of local experimentation, what I know about Frome is that it was one of these kind of small town, rural town councils, so not a city or a principal council level, where, you know, it was quite moribund in the sense that people from whichever party were in there at the time were getting elected without much effort, and were not really telling people about what they were doing, or really using the powers or the soft power even that they had. So basically a group of people of, I think, quite different political perspectives just came together and said, we'll have a go at this. They stood in the elections on the basis of saying, we're going to involve people in local decision making. They won every seat they contested, I think, and really shocked the kind of the common sense of doing things. They, you know, something quite basic like changing the layout of a room, where, you know, town council meetings were usually the councillors sat at one table at the front and all the residents were, you know, in chairs at the back. They completely changed that so that the room is a circle of tables and chairs, and, you know, if you're a resident rather than a councillor, you can still sit in the same place. You know, the voting system hasn't changed that much, but that says something really important about people's views being taken into account. So it's basically it's the thing about participation again. It's saying, rather than what do I need to do to get enough people to vote for me so that I can wield the power that's vested to me by this bureaucracy, it's how are we going to really engage the public in making decisions about their lives. And yeah, that's the main example I'd use just now.
Great, thanks, Sam. that's really interesting, the case study of Freeman. I'm sure there's lots more to learn from that. So we've got another couple of questions coming in around local stuff, and specifically around, I guess, like the future of local government, like specifically in Oxfordshire, but also more broadly. And so I'm probably going to bring in Craig and maybe Dick also on this a little bit to talk about the kind of Oxford context. But basically, for those of you who are unaware, there's kind of essentially some quite major local government reform sitting around the corner, which we mentioned at the start of the call, which could have serious ramifications for how Oxford and Oxfordshire as a whole is governed. So Craig, I wondered if you could touch a little bit so that people are aware of kind of what's sitting in the pipeline and what the kind of potential implications of that for democracy is here in Oxford, and then we'll move back to Sam for some more wider questions to finish off.
Sure. Well, I mean, Sam may be able to elaborate a little bit more about the sort of devolution white paper, which the government has promised. Well, it promised this month, in fact, early this month. But I keep asking the question of people in council offices and others, and we understand it's been delayed, but we don't know how long for. But essentially, what it's trying to do is combine, create more unitary authorities. So essentially, take local government. So in Oxford, we have a sort of Oxfordshire, and then we have the districts and city below that. So we have 5 districts and city council across Oxfordshire, including Oxford City Council being the one that I'm elected to. And the idea is to combine those authorities. And because of the electoral maths, as has been alluded to earlier, that would mean it's a very good likelihood that Oxford would be ruled by a sort of majority Conservative council. The newly reformed Oxfordshire-wide council is currently run by the Conservatives, although they're at a bit of a low ebb. In the past, it has been very strongly Conservative. It might well be that it isn't Conservative run, but the likelihood is now or in the future it will be. And the irony is, as has been mentioned earlier, Oxford City is very progressive as a city within Oxfordshire, and it hasn't elected a Conservative for more than a decade. And so that's the irony, is that a lot of the values and policies which have been hard fought at the city level, so for example, levels of affordable housing, stuff on climate change, on transport, which is more progressive and radical than the rest of the county as a whole, partly because we're a city in an urban area and so we take some different views on things. But that's likely to be subsumed within this greater unitary authority, which has very different sets of values. Privatisation is another one that comes to mind. The council kept all its services, or most of its services, rather than outsourcing them to the private sector, whereas the county did the opposite and outsourced most of its services. So that's just some of the practical differences a unitary authority could make to the people of Oxford, who in the past has shown that they don't support those sorts of measures.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Craig. And I guess Sam, is there anything that you want to jump in on there with regards to the white paper nationally, or also it might be helpful if you have any kind of reflections on what this kind of top-down decision making around local government reform tells us about the nature of our democracy. Where we've got a city which has never elected for a very long time, hasn't elected a Tory councillor, potentially having kind of a Tory council being imposed upon it.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find out much about that white paper, I'm afraid. I wonder that it might be one of the least prioritised things by the government in the situation right now. I think there are some national reforms that they'll be more interested in. But yeah, on what it means, I think what this really highlights to me is that the fact that the UK in the 21st century is not a federal or much more decentralised nation state is absolutely bonkers, because the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland very much think of themselves as different countries that are part of this union for now, at least. But that applies at a very local level as well. So if you look at somewhere like Germany, where you've got very strong federal states, you wouldn't be able to have this type of top-down reorganisation of local government. And I think that once we're further along talking about the details of what does a more democratic UK look like, and what's a more democratic England look like. We need to be thinking about what kind of settlement there is and what kind of power agreement there is between the centre in Westminster and local councils, because this situation that we've had for a number of years where powers have been taken away, responsibilities are sometimes taken away, but what we've had in recent years is responsibilities being handed over and money being taken away. So to the point where you have virtually no actual independent decision-making political power, because all you're doing is basically being like a local enforcer of austerity. And that's not real local government. That's just what I've just said that it is. So yeah, we need to think about some sort of compact, I suppose, where local government is protected from these top-down reorganisations, is raising more of its own revenue as well, so that austerity can't be enforced in the same way. So that's what I'd say about that, I think.
Great, thanks, Sam. And I just a quick follow-up on that. I guess one of the interesting things about the way that I guess our local government operates at least in England, is obviously there's the kind of top-down government decision making that has a real impact on the ability for local councils to make decisions on certain areas, as you've said, in terms of like the access to funding that they have and so on. But there's also, I guess, like the wider economic system that can sometimes have a real impact on the decision making that councils are able to make. So a really good example of this is we've recently sadly seen the closure of Robin Hood Energy, which was the first kind of municipally owned energy company for a long time, and it was essentially, I guess, it was basically forced into bankruptcy by a totally rigged energy market that's been rigged by national government policy and an economic policy which prioritises the interests of the big six energy companies and kind of wider business interests more generally. So I guess, do you think that there's a really, in like talking about talking about democratic reform, how big of a role do you see, economic reform and economic justice more generally playing? And do you think that needs to be, say, for example, when you're talking about a written constitution, there are, certain countries where it's constitutionally illegal to privatise utilities, for example, it's like written into them. Do you see things like that as being part of the kind of new constitutional settlement that you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really critical way of really capturing the imagination of the public in a process like that. So we did some polling a couple of years ago now on, firstly, do you support a written constitution? And 65% of the public agreed with that. But we also asked at the same time, if we had a written constitution, what rights would you like to be enshrined in that? And we just saw enormous majorities, both for things you'd expect, like the right to healthcare, but the right to a job, the right to housing, like really, really enormous majorities for this, which surprised us a little bit, but it really shows the disconnect between how the public thinks of democracy, where they think that there's entitlements and rights that we should have, from this very limited kind of liberal political democracy that is how politics is conducted in the UK. And when these processes have when these processes have been done in other countries, this is exactly the sort of thing that comes out. So you've talked already about other countries where there are, constitutional provisions banning privatisation, for example. But in Iceland, when there was a constitutional convention to rewrite theirs after the banking crash, the public actually specifically, there was a specific question in the referendum on this: do you want to nationalise the fishing rights? And there was a huge majority for yes. And unfortunately, fishing interests managed to get a government elected that didn't implement that constitution. But that just shows how, when people are really talking about these things and what kind of country we should be, they come on to quite radical economic things really quickly. And something I only learned last week actually was that in Ireland, we've had these referendums to legalise equal marriage and to legalise abortion. But those two citizens' assemblies came out of a broader constitutional convention looking at things that need to be changed. And one other group that I haven't heard anything about was that the public were wanting to really radically reform land ownership in Ireland, which is something that's been really concentrated and very controversial in the past. But the public wants to see that addressed to deal with, skyrocketing house prices. but that's something that's not being picked up in the kind of media coverage that reaches us. So yeah, whenever you have these processes, people talk about economic and social justice. I think that has to be really integral to this process of kind of reforming the state here in the UK.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. So we've got quite a few more questions that have trickled in at the end, and there's a comment just popped up in the chat on the proposals around local government reform, and I'm going to bring Craig back in at the end to maybe talk a little bit just to finish off about how we're going to be responding to the local government reform proposals here in Oxford. Before I do that, I just wanted to squeeze a couple more questions in for Sam. And we've got a really interesting question here around the balance of funding for local government. So the question is, how would you balance local government generating its own revenue against the fact that in the UK we have huge differences between how wealth is distributed geographically? So you've got an extremely wealthy London and the southeast relative to other parts of the country. So if you're making councils reliant on generating their own income, isn't that going to kind of exacerbate regional inequalities with, you know, councils in wealthy areas able to raise more revenues from wealthier citizens than councils in less wealthy areas?
This is a tricky one. So, you know, one of the central arguments that's been made about, you know, why the union is a good thing and why the kind of like British social contract is a good thing is because of that level of solidarity that you certainly used to have, where tax was collected at a national level, then was redistributed to areas based on needs. But in England in particular, the past kind of 10 years have really shown a reversal of that process, where almost all central government support has been taken away, and poorer areas are left with really, really massive levels of customer service as well. Wealthier ones, like the Oxfordshire county, for example, are comparatively in a much better situation because there's lower levels of need. So I don't have a ready-made answer to that one, but I think it needs to be a question in, you know, if local government was to have some sort of, you know, convention of its own to discuss what sorts of compact should it collectively have with central government, and how is that reflected in a new constitution, that there is some process of solidarity and of, you know, getting rid of the levels of uneven economic development that we have. But I think it also makes a central case that is something that can't be kind of that can't be kept in a silo, that you know, we have to be campaigning in other parts of life and in other movements to have more even economic development, and not having wealth concentrated in a handful of places.
Brilliant. That's a really useful response to that question. I'm glad I wasn't tasked with answering it. I think we've got time for a couple more questions that I'm going to squeeze in before I hand back to Craig. So we've got one here which is about the question that you mentioned around how important is the voting system in the context of the wider democratic settlement. And the question is, often we hear calls for democratic reform, but these are almost solely about how much we need to have PR. And it sometimes feels like advocates of PR see this as a silver bullet. But how do you see us being able to broaden the kind of wider public understanding of what radical democracy would look like? And are there any other kind of key calls for reform or change that you think people should be demanding as part of campaigning for political reform?
So I think that my theory for this at the moment is that the best way that we can build support for the kind of deeper democratization that we're talking about is to give people the experience of it. So there is a really big job on, you know, progressives that have either a foothold in local government, and, you know, that's something the Green Party has a lot more of now than it used to have. It's in, you know, has the balance of power in a number of councils now. It could use that influence to start using processes like citizens' assemblies, like maybe even looking at reforms to how the local plans are decided for interest within the law that lets you do that. it's just really about trying to think of new ways to engage people in coming together and talking about what the decision that can be made. But I think that, you know, there's another thing thinking at a national level, which is that these calls for what people call democratic reform, I don't really like that term, because what we're calling for is actually quite revolutionary, and I think we need to excite people about that. It's not about a list of tweaks to make the British, it's not a list of tweaks to make representative democracy fit for purpose again. It's about fundamentally expanding the idea of democracy. And, you know, the people in power at the moment have a very narrow idea of what democracy is, which is it's who wins the most number of votes on one day, and pretty much anything goes in service of that goal, with all the rule breaking that we've talked about earlier on. So saying, you know, the reason that we don't have economic justice is because of the loaded political system. The reason that all these, you know, other injustices in society are strongly upheld is because we have this post-imperial state that is fossilized in place, basically. So it's about saying, you know, things like we need participation if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, for example. So it's, you know, it's the way that we're going to have to solve all of these challenges together. So I think we can excite people about it by saying this is going to be something really different, but also people that have a local foothold do have a role to help people actually experience this and show that it does work.
Thanks, Sam. That's a really brilliant segue into the final question I was going to ask you, which is, so you mentioned there about like giving people kind of the experience of what democracy looks like as part of that process. And one of the things you touched on it earlier was the idea of participatory budgeting. And that's something that the Green councillors in Oxford have previously engaged in a process of, in the small amounts of money that they've had access to, is be engaging in participatory budgeting processes. And it's something that I know that Craig and Dick are talking about potentially doing again in the future. So I was wondering if you could touch briefly on, before we wrap up, what participatory budgeting is and what it looks like in practice, and why you see it as an important aspect of democracy.
Sure. So, you know, I was having a conversation with someone last week about kind of the differences in how politics works in the UK now, and in certain places in Latin America where a lot of these kind of participatory processes have jumped up, and kind of why there are those differences. And, you know, the history of Britain is where we had this sort of radical Labour government elected that nationalised things and provided all these services for people, but basically ran them like corporations where people didn't have any real say in how they were run, and they were things that were either given to you or things that were done to you. They weren't things that you did together. So that's quite distinct from places like certain places in Latin America where people don't survive unless they are talking to their neighbours and helping their neighbours out. So I think in Britain you have this thing where people don't think about how government money is spent, or are encouraged to think about it in terms of what will they get, rather than we have this community that has these different sets of needs, and together we need to work out what is most important, or what things will have, you know, positive spillover effects that will either get money from somewhere else or build up other types of community capacity. So the reason I think it's important is because it has, you know, it really changes something. It's not just having a discussion about how things should be. It's about having a pot of money and feeling really empowered to say, you know, the decision that we make tonight or as part of this process is going to actually affect things. And when I was involved in one of the versions of this we did in Oxford, we really felt the kind of energy in the room about that. It was mostly students that time, and it was mostly like social action projects rather than like boosts for local public services, for example. And that is something I'd like to experience quite soon, where people are saying, right, the community centre on the end of my road is going to get more money, for example. So yeah, I think that it gives people their first kind of taste of what actually making decisions together is like, and it provides that really important ingredient at the start of this. There's money in this for our community, so it really matters what decision we make, and we feel really responsible for making the right decision.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Sam. That's a really nice place to end that on, in terms of envisaging how we can rebuild and our democracy in a revolutionary way, as you say. So before I kind of wrap everything up, I just wanted to hand back to Craig briefly, in case there's anything additional that you wanted to say on the white paper and the resistance to the potential One Oxfordshire proposals, and kind of what the next steps are in fighting against them.
Sure. I mean, this is not the first time we've had a threat of a unitary authority. As you mentioned, they're previously called the One Oxfordshire proposals, which we faced in 2017. At that point, they were again looking to do a similar unitary authority, and the Greens responded with a position paper which said, clearly there are advantages to having a single authority managing transport, for example, which is currently split, and some other waste management split between authorities. And it's confusing for residents, but also, you know, there are potential cost savings to be had. So what we proposed as an alternative to the single mega authority across Oxfordshire was 3 unitary authorities. So North Oxfordshire, South Oxfordshire, and they're already doing some shared services anyway, and retaining the city as a unitary authority. So rather than having one huge authority covering the whole of Oxfordshire, which is around 600,000 people, to have a sort of north, a south, and an Oxford City unitary. Now the problem, so we don't know what's in the devolution white paper yet. We have had a series of leaks, you know, that we're you know, basically when asked questions in Parliament, ministers have said it's more mayors and more unitary authorities. And they've gone as far as saying, when they mean mayors, they don't mean like mayor like me, I'm the Lord Mayor of Oxford, they mean executive mayors who have power to make decisions on behalf of the whole council, which Oxford also had an opportunity to vote for some years back and voted against it overwhelmingly. They're also saying that these authorities can't be will be a minimum of 300 to 400,000. So that means that somewhere like Oxford only has half that amount of people, so it wouldn't be considered for a unitary under these new proposals, which we haven't seen, but that's what the leak says. So what the Greens are going to be doing is we haven't responded yet because we haven't had the white paper out, but we're ready to respond with our response from last time, and we'll use that as the basis for our response. We might change our view depending on what we've seen. There is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. They've talked about, you know, strengthening parish and town councils as part of those proposals. We'll see what they turn out to be. But we ran a campaign last time called Save Oxford from Tory Rule. We still have, you know, the Facebook page, so sign up to that if you're interested in getting involved. And then no doubt we will then use that as the platform for responding to these new proposals. Interestingly, last time the Tories supported the unitary authority at Oxfordshire, as did the Lib Dems. Labour was split on it, so their county councillors wanted the unitary, the city councillors didn't. So we were the only party that was united at the county and city level in opposing the One Oxfordshire proposals. We don't know whether it will be the same again this time, but we're certainly ready to sort of lead on that campaign.
Fantastic, thanks Craig, and thanks for those of you who've been asking about those proposals in the chat. Watch this space because as and when we see these proposals come forward, then we will be doing everything we can to ensure a fair settlement for Oxford and for the future of our kind of local democracy. So
put the link to the Facebook page in the chat. So
exactly, yeah. So you can follow that Facebook page there. So that's all from us this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, of course, to Sam for joining us from Unlocked Democracy. It's been a fascinating talk to hear about the potential for a better democracy. Lord knows we absolutely need it. I've learned a huge amount, and I hope you have too. And hopefully, some of the things that Sam has been talking about, you're going to see from Craig and Dick and Rosie and myself in the future. Putting some of these principles, particularly around participatory budgeting and so on, into practice here in Oxford. I'm not going to take up a huge amount more of your time. I just wanted to really quickly say that Sam has put a link in there to Unlocked Democracy's website. Do take a look at that. It's a fantastic organisation doing incredible work. I'll also send around that link in the follow-up email. which will go around to all of you who registered. There'll also be a link to a recording of this call in there. So if you do want to share a recording of this around to anyone that you know that would be interested, please do. We want to get as many people engaged in these ideas as possible. The final thing I wanted to say is just to say that this is, as was mentioned at the beginning, part of a series of events that we're hosting on a range of different issues. We've had everything from the health sector to tackling climate change, to this talk tonight on democracy. And as Dick said at the start, on the 14th of October, we're incredibly lucky to have the co-leader of the Green Party, Sian Berry, joining us to be talking about how we solve the housing crisis. And right away, you can sign up to join that call right now by clicking the link in the chat. Please do sign up, please do share that link with your friends and on social media. It'd be fantastic to have as many people there as possible, because obviously here in Oxford we all feel the brunt of very much feel the brunt of the housing system and how much of a crisis it really is in. So that is all from me, that's all from us. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays.
Thanks very much, all.
Bye everyone.
Thank you.